Gene Simmons has regrets that haunt him to this day.
And they should have been here with us 50 or 55 years later and enjoying the fruits of their labor.
Feeling this way despite all the success Kiss has had is very shocking because he was the no-nonsense yapper of the group.
Like it is. He doesn't say one thing and then behind your back say something else. He'll tell you right to your face what he thinks.
So why did it take a while for him to finally break his silence on Ace Frehley? Just like their theatrical costumes, there's more to the story than meets the eye. But to get to the bottom of things, we need to take a trip down memory lane. Kiss didn't start as Kiss. Oh no! In 1972, Paul Stanley and Gene Simmons were members of another group called Wicked Lester. But if this New York-based band wanted to be bigger, they needed to make some drastic changes. And they had to start with finding band members that matched their vision. They would start with a drummer. After seeing an ad for a nightclub performance, they showed up to witness the brilliance of Peter Criss. His performance needed no second thoughts. They asked him to be part of their audition for a drummer, and that's how Paul and Gene found their first member. As much as this was progress, it was only half of it. They still needed a guitarist. The trio put out an ad in the local newspaper, The Village Voice. Quite a few people showed up, but there was somebody who stood out, and not for the right reasons. This guitarist showed up with a different color of sneakers on each foot. Going by his appearance, it didn't look like he belonged there, but when he started playing, that's how Ace Frehley left Paul, Gene, and Peter so stunned they couldn't believe what they had heard. So another audition followed a week or two later. Ace Frehley still produced the same magic he did the first time. This was a man who felt rock and roll was his calling. I always knew music was the way for me to go. It was clear rock and roll was the only life for me. It was after they had all members in place that they decided to name the band Kiss, a play on Peter's old band name, Lips. Although they didn't have a record label deal yet, this didn't stop them from going all out. After getting their sound right, they now had to worry about their image and everything they stood for as a band. This led them to don face paint and create a whole new aesthetic that the rock scene had never seen before. Along with this, they also adapted unique nicknames. Gene became the Demon, Paul the Star Child, Peter the Catman. Ace, inspired by his love of science fiction, became the one and only Spaceman, sometimes called Space Ace. These antics seemed crazy, but only time would tell if it would turn out to be a genius move or foolishness from four grown men chasing their dreams in vain. At first, it looked like the band was going to be a bust. In one of their earlier gigs on January 30th, 1973 in Queens, New York, they performed in front of less than a dozen people. The attendance was low, but their earnings were more embarrassing. A measly $50. This was far too little for a group that wanted to dedicate their life to this, and they couldn't afford to do that well, at least not that early. Each band member had a day job they were doing to earn enough to get by before they would get together in the night to play riffs and solos. The four of them lived in a budget motel, and Ace was delivering liquor while Paul worked at sandwich shops. This was not what they envisioned for themselves, and if things weren't going to change soon, they would have no choice but to give up on their dream. But if the next 2 years proved anything, it was that maybe something good could come out of music. Towards the end of 1973, Kiss signed a deal with the newly formed Casablanca Records, and they had opened for Blue Oyster Cult at the Academy of Music in New York. Not long after, they scored a TV interview as well. It seemed like they were making progress, but it was more or less like an illusion. Their debut album barely sold 75,000 units, and they were still not where they wanted to be. Gene Simmons recalled the reality of things when the band had started stating, "The early years of Kiss were far from glamorous. We rode in a station wagon hundreds of miles every day. We would take turns driving and sleeping in the back. We ate burgers at roadside taverns. We ate beans and franks because we couldn't afford better food as we were on an $85 a week salary." It had been over a year since the Kiss was formed, and they still hadn't experienced what they would call a breakout moment yet. To make matters worse, their label, Casablanca Records, was on the verge of bankruptcy. This added more pressure on them to figure out a way to stay relevant. But what made it worse was that there wasn't much they hadn't done to achieve this. They were making solid music. Their performances had memorable theatrics, and not to mention, the whole point of wearing makeup and costumes was to garner attention. They still had one trick up their sleeve: a live album. This was a bold and daring move. It had never been attempted before. This was the make or break moment for the Kiss. It was Neil Bogart, the founder and president of Casablanca Records, who had come up with the idea for Kiss to release a live album. The album, titled Alive, was a compilation of recordings of live concert audio from Kiss's tour. They added guitar solos performed by Frehley and audience noise to it. The album aimed to give casual listeners the excitement that fans have felt when they were on tour. It was meant to make their music feel alive. It achieved this, and more. It breathed more life into the band, with the album going gold and giving the band their first top 40 single. With their newfound momentum, Kiss weren't about to slow down. A year later, in 1976, they released their third album, Destroyer, once again achieving gold. Not only had they gotten their long-awaited breakthrough, but their success looked like it was here to stay. Paul Stanley once recalled, "I saw a pattern emerging with us on the road. Every night I'd ask somebody before the show, 'How are we doing?' Which meant, 'What's the attendance?' One night they said, 'It's sold out,' and then the next night I'd hear the same thing." Kiss wasn't just a mainstream band. They were a staple of not just rock culture, but music as a whole. By 1977, they had a gross income of over $10 million. Merchandise sales were reaching 9 figures, and they were appearing in kid shows and comics. They weren't the same band that was living off $80 a week and living together in cheap motels, sharing beds. As much as this was a good thing, it did have its downsides. Kiss had reached what many believed was the pinnacle of their success, but they didn't believe so, and Casablanca Records certainly didn't. Kiss had already done different types of albums, live ones, experimental ones, and core albums. They needed something they hadn't done before, and they didn't have many options. But there was something they hadn't done yet, a solo album each. In 1978, each member of Kiss had a solo album released. Gene Simmons' album did the best, but Frehley's album later outsold it and was the only album to have a top 40 hit. The move to have solo albums seemed to be a business move for Kiss to fulfill their record deal contract obligations. But it was deeper than just a contract. There was more to it than just paperwork, something sinister. The truth is, success had changed Kiss, but not in a good way. Ace Frehley recalled how the newfound fame was starting to get to their head. "Once we became rich, we all became millionaires, and everybody started going their own way. Everybody had their own limo. Everybody had their own bodyguard. So, nothing can last forever." But this was just the beginning of their problems. According to Ace Frehley, he had always been dealt the short end of the stick. While the team was working on their solo album, there was a meeting with the rest of the record label. It was here that the Ace heard what would confirm where he stood with the rest of his bandmates. "Ace, if you need any help on your album, don't hesitate to give us a call." These were the words that Paul Stanley and Gene Simmons told Ace. It seemed like they were just being generous, but to Ace, it was an insult. It was a jab at him. How dare they underestimate his ability? But when the solo albums were out and he did better than everyone expected, Ace had an epiphany. In an interview with the magazine Goldmine, Ace revealed this shocking truth. There was that feeling of, "I'm going to show you guys I don't need your help." And the success of the album proved that. "I realized I was more creative away from those guys because they're control freaks, and they like things the way they like them." According to Ace, making solo albums was a good idea. Not just market-wise, the creative differences of each band member were starting to cause friction and agitation amongst themselves. So this project felt like a breather. However, this merely bought more time for Kiss by delaying the inevitable. All of Kiss's problems remained out of the public eye until their fracture became so evident that they couldn't hide it. On October 31st, 1979, during an interview on Tom Snyder's The Tomorrow Show, Ace Frehley was trying to be the main character, but Gene and Paul weren't having it.
Tell me about it!
But Ace wasn't the only person who felt wronged by the band. Peter Criss had his own problems with Kiss as well. And since he wasn't as talented as Ace, he didn't have much leverage. That's why when he was dismissed from the band in 1980, the public wasn't too startled about it. This put things at odds between Ace and the rest of the band. The new drummer, Eric Carr, didn't have voting rights, so Ace often found himself outvoted 2-1 on major decisions. And all this did was push Ace further towards the edge. But how much could he really take? And how long could this really continue for? It didn't take long for Ace to decide his fate. After seeing that Gene Simmons and Stanley were constantly shutting him down and he couldn't have his way in the slightest, he decided it was time to go solo. Ace recalled what gave him the courage to make the decision. "I had made up my mind after the success of my solo album that I was much more creative away from them than with them. So I really felt that I needed to go out my own." But the crazy part is that as much as Ace felt he wasn't wanted in the band, Gene Simmons didn't feel the same. In fact, from his point of view, Frehley looked more like a hypocrite and a liar than an oppressed victim. Gene felt Peter and Ace not being founding members would make them feel like less, so he made sure not to give the impression that anybody was more important in the band. And as for Peter Criss leaving the band, Ace was actually more keen than anyone to get a new drummer and have him dumped. But like Ace said, he had his mind made up, and the rest of Kiss were going to have to make peace with that. With Ace now solo, he was replaced by Vinnie Vincent, and only half of the band was made up of original members. Ace started his own band and named the Frehley's Comet. He recruited Anton Fig on the drums and John Regan on the bass guitar, as much as Frehley didn't want his identity to overshadow the presence of other band members, because that would make him a hypocrite. But time would soon tell if leaving Kiss was the right decision. At first it seemed like it was. With the release of the album titled Frehley's Comet, it sold almost 500,000 copies and charted at number 43 on the Billboard Top 200. As much as he was still the creative genius he was no longer part of the culturally relevant band Kiss. And this made going solo seem like a downgrade. Kiss, on the other hand, had recovered from the financial loss Frehley's leaving had cost them. In fact, they had reinvented themselves yet again by deciding not to perform without makeup while dropping chart-topping bodies of work. However, behind closed doors, things weren't so smooth. Vinnie Vincent, who had replaced Ace Frehley, was proving to be a headache. In an interview with Guitar World, Gene Simmons revealed just how heated things go with Ace's replacement. Vinnie wanted to make every solo this massive thing, but Paul and I would bring him specific solos. It got to the point where we had to put our foot down. We didn't feel we needed to be in a situation where we were fighting with Vinnie Vincent over how the songs should sound. But by the beginning of the 90s, Kiss were in a bad place. Eric Carr was terminally ill, and Vinnie Vincent was fired and replaced by Bruce Kulick. But at MTV Unplugged, Kiss gave the music world the shock of their lives. Peter Criss and Ace Frehley had returned. If anybody thought that Kiss's original lineup would reunite after almost 2 decades, they would have been tagged as delusional. But here, it was actually happening. For the next half-decade, Kiss continued touring and selling out shows like they were still in the 80s. But at the turn of the new millennium, there were plenty of rumors circulating that Father's Time had perhaps caught up with the band, and retirement was around the corner for them. The band releasing a career compilation of their songs as the box set really hinted that this band was about to call it a day. But Ace was back with the band, and he would be saying goodbye together with them. At least that's what it seemed like. During the band's farewell tour in 2000, Ace Frehley reminded Gene why having him back wasn't such a good idea. During a performance at Irvine, Ace showed up so late that Gene and Paul believed that they were going to have to go on stage without him. By the time Ace got there, a fully dressed Tommy Thayer had been dressed up and ready to hit the stage. Gene was absolutely livid with Ace's behavior and attitude. What made him feel worse was the fact that he had Peter's brash attitude to deal with the other night. Gene didn't have much to say about these two other than describing them as disrespectful toward everything we had accomplished and everything the fans were giving us. As much as it's easy to perceive Ace's attitude as brash and uncalled for, something happened a year prior that could serve as a possible cause. During the 1999 shooting of a movie about the band titled Detroit Rock City, Gene was part of the team of editors, and footage of Ace's daughter being edited out felt too intentional to be a coincidence. He felt Gene was getting at him by hurting someone close to him. Frehley stated this: "I knew it wasn't an accident. Gene had been involved in the editing process on a daily basis. He was probably pissed at me for something I had done, but to get back at me by hurting my daughter? He had reached an all-time low with me." Fast forward 2 years, the closing ceremony of the 2002 Winter Olympics was the last time Frehley would perform with Kiss before calling it quits. For the second time, what made his second departure worse was that Kiss didn't leave much room for a return. Tommy Thayer became a permanent member instead of a temporary fill-in, and this was made certain by his donning Ace's nickname, Spaceman. As much as Ace performed with Kiss again 16 years later at Kiss Cruise, it was only for the fans and the money. And if anything, that show proved that there was no getting back. They actually paid me $15,000 not to do a Q&A. What are they afraid that I'm going to say? Would I ever do another Kiss Cruise? No. I just didn't like the way I was treated. I did that first set with the guys, and then I never heard from them again. These were Ace's words following the Kiss Cruise concert. So when the end of the road tour came around, Ace wasn't going to be a part of it. He had reached the end of his road with Kiss. His path with his former band had once again diverged, this time never to cross each other or intertwine again. Ace Frehley and Gene Simmons started out on the best of notes, but when fame and fortune became their new norm, they started to slowly grow apart. Or was it that they were just tolerating each other till their dream came true? Do you think Gene Simmons is right to feel the way he felt about Ace? Or is the Spaceman the victim here? Let us know your thoughts in the comment section, and don't forget to subscribe and check out more videos on our channel like these.